Hi, just the first video to introduce the learning approach, classical conditioning, and with that, Little Albert. I'll try and get Little Albert in at the end. So remember, the assumptions of the learning approach, sometimes called behaviorism, but we'll get away with the learning approach, is that you are born a blank slate. Absolutely everything about you is learned. So you are born with no characteristics, no personality, no behaviors, and everything about you gets learned from that point on. It's learned through the process of association and reinforcement. So we're talking about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then later on they obviously realised things about social learning theory and learning through observation. And finally, the third one is that the learning approach, or psychology in general, should be scientific as possible. We should only measure objective, measurable, scientific things. If we are to be taken seriously as a subject, we can't be looking at things that we can't measure inside your head. Each one of these slides now just kind of highlights these points. Feel free to pause it and have a read of them as we go through, if you want to talk about expanding on those quick points we've made. So the learning approach, remember, studies the relationship between stimulus and response. It says that we are very mechanistic in the way that we work, and we experience something, we see something, we are given something, a stimulus, and it causes a response. It's almost like a mathematical problem. This causes that, cause and effect. And they believe this about all human behaviour. So obviously Homer Simpson and beer. Beer is the stimulus, and Homer would drool or dribble or enjoy the beer. So a stimulus is any aspect of our environment we can interact with, and sorry, I'm just moving this out of the way, and the response would vary depending on what is going on, but it's the observable action that is being carried out and seen. We also operate via the law of effect. Basically, if we repeat a stimulus so many times, we associate them together. So if we do two things at the same time, we associate the two of them together, and we will expect the other one to come as well. This is called the law of exercise. That is made much more clearly with Pavlov. So Pavlov is the very famous psychologist. He invented classical conditioning, or really defined it. And what he was interested in was the natural salivatory reflex in dogs. Remember, he was a biologist to start with, and he was interested in how or why dogs salivated, or how much saliva they produced. This is a natural reaction. So you naturally produce saliva when you're exposed to foodstuff. What Pavlov noticed over a period of time, however, was that there were some anomalies. Sometimes the dog would salivate before the food was even presented. This is because what had happened was he had paired this with people coming into the room, or very famously, the famous example, he did it with lots of things, people coming in and out of the rooms, metronomes, and famously though, he did it with the bell. And what had happened is the dog had associated the bell with the food being presented. So it had learnt that whenever it hears a bell, or in this case whenever somebody comes into the room, that it would be getting fed. So every time that first thing happened, the bell rang or a researcher walked in, the dog would start to salivate. And this is how we came up with the concept of classical conditioning. It associated the bell and the food together, so every time the bell occurred, so did the result of salivating. So we've got these natural reflexes. Your natural reflexes are things like smell food, start to salivate. This fits into the classical conditioning formula. So remember, and this is something that you need to go to know, we've got the UCS, unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus in the case of Pavlov would be the food. This leads to the natural response of salivating. You can always tell if you've got this top level right, because it should be a natural response. It shouldn't be like the bell causes salivating, because that doesn't happen naturally. It's the food causes salivating. Then at the next level, again, food, unconditional stimulus, plus the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus in this case being the bell, leads to the unconditioned response. Again, it would be salivating. At this point, stage 2, it's still the food is causing the salivation, but we've included the bell. And then what happens is eventually the bell by itself is enough to cause the conditioned response, of salivating. The UCR and CR are always the exact same thing. So if you ask to fill one of these out, these three should be the same thing. This is the natural response, and then we should be able to figure out what the CS is, and it'll be the last thing left. Occasionally there'll also be an NS, a neutral stimulus, and all that is the CS before it gets paired. So before it becomes associated, the CS is called the NS, the neutral or the neutral stimulus. So again, just a quick outline of how that worked with Pavlov's dog. The big question from Pavlov, though, became, can this work with people? Does this just apply to animals? And it does. This is how we learn phobias, which is in a second is about to bring us on to our core study that you need to know of little Albert. First, a couple more definitions. So if the UCS and the CS aren't paired for a while, so if we keep ringing the bell and we don't give the dog food, eventually this association will go extinct. The dog will stop expecting food to be presented whenever it hears the bell, because it's happened for so long that it hasn't, which means the behaviour will go extinct. The association between the two of them will stop if you wait long enough if you wait long enough while you ring the bell and don't give the dog any food. This can, however, come back. It can come back after one more link. So, say 20 times we've rung the bell and not give the dog any food, the behaviours went extinct. We ring the bell once and give the dog food again, and it will come back as strong as ever, or nearly as strong as ever. We call this spontaneous recovery. And finally, there's two more. Generalization. So Pavlov's dogs, if they'd heard another bell, if they'd heard another stimulus that was like the one that they'd learned, they might have drooled. We call this generalization. So people who are scared of spiders might also be scared of beetles or woodlice or something like that, where you have the same response to stimulus which is similar to one that you've learned. And discrimination is the opposite. If we'd rang another bell and Pavlov's dogs didn't drool, that's because they were discriminating between the two sounds of the bells. Only the very specific stimulus causes the response. So that brings us on the work of Watson and Rayner, which is the study of little Albert, which is one of the core studies. John Watson was a learning psychologist, a behaviourist, who believed that you could turn anyone or cause any sort of behaviour through this learning procedure. He set out to test that to see if they could teach a small child a phobia. So the aim of this was Watson wanted to believe that emotional responses such as phobias were learned. So he wanted to see whether he could condition a fear into a child. Could he teach a child to be scared? Would that fear become generalised to other things? And what was the effect of time on that conditioning? Would the phobias go away? So little Albert was raised in a hospital. His mum was a wet nurse there, so that was just his natural kind of living environment, because she lived in the hospital as well. He was seen as being a healthy, stolid and unemotional child. And when he was about 9 months old, they tested him for various fears. So was he scared of rats? Was he scared of rabbits? Did he have a problem with a fire, a monkey on a chain? Things like that. The only thing that really bothered him was loud noises behind him. So when he was 11 months and 3 days old, they began the therapy, or they began the treatment. When they brought the rat into a room, little Albert would reach for the rat and they would start to bang a metal bar behind his head. When they banged this metal bar behind the head, he jumped and fell forward, got very upset, and when they did it again, he began to cry. The fear of the noise had upset him. But what had happened was, over time, they did this 7 different times with him over the course of this study. He associated the rat with the noise, so became scared of the rat. He became conditioned that the rat would cause noise, so the rat by itself made him scared. They looked at generalization of the fear when he was 11 months, and 15 days old. So to calm him down after they'd done this the once, they gave him some blocks to play with. When they tested him again, he was still scared of the rat. So they didn't need to make the noise, just presenting the rat was enough to cause him fear. They tried him with a few other things as well. So he was scared of a rabbit, so he tried to crawl away and was crying. So again, a white, fluffy rodent. He was fine with building blocks. He played well with them, and they often used those to calm him down. He was scared of a dog, he was scared of a fur coat, he was scared of cotton wool and a Santa mask. Anything that reminded him of the rat was enough to cause the fear response. The fear had been generalised. By the time he was 11 months and 20 days old, they continued the same thing again. And this showed that the results carried on for at least a month's time. They couldn't do any further testing because his mum had seen how much this experiment had upset him and withdrew him from the experiment. This is the exam summary. This was from a 6-mark question asking you to summarise Watson and Rayner's study of little Albert. So as you can see, they wanted to see the emotional response a child could be taught. They wanted to make him afraid of a stimulus. They presented him with lots of different things. Only thing that scared him was the banging of a hammer. They paired the rat with the noise 7 times. You can get within 1 of that, so you could say 6 or 8, but 7 is the number. They gave him blocks to calm down with. What they found was he was scared of the rat even when presented without the noise. He was also scared of other furry objects that become generalised. And so Watson and Rayner conclude that fear could be learned. This is some evaluation points to go with that. I won't read through them, and obviously we did this in class. So that is the basics of classical conditioning and the study of little Albert.